So, hello everyone, and welcome today to what's going to be the first episode of The Verdict in quite some time. It's actually already 2019, but today I want to talk about Darksiders 3, which came out in November of 2018. And specifically, I did a playthrough on it, as I always do with games that I put on The Verdict. And I just wanted to really briefly break it down. Perhaps the number one thing that I could say about Darksiders 3 is that it's a long-running franchise that has a pretty decent fan base. I think it's on the smaller side, but people are pretty loyal to it and do like the game. And this time around, since all the stuff happened with Darksiders 2 and THQ basically going out of business and Nordic Games acquiring Darksiders, I think there's been a huge tonal shift between the first two games and this game. But let's get into it and break it down piece by piece. So for starters, I want us to talk about the aspect of the game that I think is basically on par with the other two games, which is the story. The story of Darksiders 3, much like the previous game set before, it follows one of the horsemen of the apocalypse throughout this gigantic mythology that they've concocted, where the Horseman War brings about the apocalypse early, and essentially throughout the first game he has to figure out why this has happened and what's going on, and so on and so forth. And he's wrongfully accused by his ruling body, the Charred Council, of having done it maliciously. And later on, you find out a whole bunch of other stuff I'm not going to get into. But in the first game, the intro part takes place in modern times, and then they flash forward 100 years where you continue to play as War. And Darksiders 2 took place in that 100-year time span as Death, another horseman, tries to find and vindicate War. He gets embroiled in his own plot line and everything. This game pretty much follows Darksiders 2, at least in the story aspect, in the sense that you play as Fury, another of the horsemen, and her role basically throughout these 100 years is to figure out, well, it's not over 100 years, but during this 100-year time skip that War has, Fury's whole role is to find and hunt down the 7 deadly sins who have been released unto the world, and basically to kill them and bring back order for the Charred Council. And the whole theme of the game is balance. The balance between heaven and hell and their warring armies, the balance between power, the balance just in general of the universe, and why things always tend to slide towards ruin, which is a pretty interesting theme, and I did like it a lot. I think that Fury is a decent character. I think a lot of people kind of dismiss her as being cookie cutter, which she kind of is. There's not too much character growth, per se, from Fury as compared to Death, whereas War kind of also didn't have much character growth. I think that's just due to the Horsemen kind of having very anti-hero natures, just in general, because they're, not exactly the most sociable of people. At least of the Horsemen we've seen. So, just for instance, Fury isn't an awful hero, but in general, you're not going to get too much more from her than a general disdain for most of the game, just of having to do this role and of the people she has to meet with and work with and fight against. So there's not exactly going to be a rich diversity of character dialogue and uniqueness, which is fine because it's not really what we're here for Darksiders from. We're mostly here for the gameplay and the action and the adventure. But for a story, I don't think it's bad. I think that the game kind of does deliver in the same way that Darksiders 1 and 2 do. Whereas we start with a very simple plot line and it progresses. But even while I say the story is good, I don't think the story of Darksiders 3 is on par with the stories of Darksiders 1 and 2. While Darksiders 1 starts out with this pretty simple conspiracy and it branches out into this really broad plot, which is well done, but also just very all-encapsulating. Darksiders 2 also takes that step and has a more personal story about Death and his past and what he's done, and it ultimately ends on a pretty satisfying note to tie it in with the first game. This game kind of tries to do the same with Fury, and it doesn't do it poorly, it just doesn't do it on the same level that I would say that Darksiders 2 really nailed it, because Darksiders 2 was a really, really good game, and unfortunately, when I initially started doing verdicts as reviews, it wasn't until 2013, whereas there were a whole bunch of games in 2012 I did play and I did no verdicts on because it just didn't exist at the time. But Darksiders 2 would have gotten pretty much about a a low to mid 90 from me, and Darksiders 1 would have gotten like a high 80, maybe a 90, because these games are good. But the story isn't as up to snuff, which can be redeemable if the gameplay, carries the rest of it and whatnot. I want to talk about the graphics next. The graphics of this game look pretty decent. I think that, they put a lot of time and effort into keeping with the Darksiders art style. That's probably one of its more unique traits. It's kind of like a mix of like Warcraft and Diablo a bit, which is pretty cool. It's got a lot of detail on the characters. You feel like everything in the world, or at least every character in the world, is kind of well done and well designed. And I did like that a lot. I think that the look really does contribute to the unique factor of Darksiders. It kind of fills this like niche of high detailed comic book style villains and monstrosities and stuff with religious overtones and whatnot. So I have to give them some credit for that. I think that the graphical style and just the graphics of the game are pretty decent. The soundtrack is okay. I mean, again, I don't think it's up to snuff with the second game, but I think it's on par with the first game. And that's kind of a reoccurring thing I had when I played Darksiders 3. At this point, it's been a while since I played it. But that's kind of a reoccurring thing and feeling that I had while playing it, is that this game feels more in line with Darksiders 1 than Darksiders 3, which isn't necessarily something awful. It just means that, well, Darksiders 2 had all these great, 2012 advances for the series itself. And I mean, again, 2012 was 6 years ago. Well, I mean, at the time this game came out, that was 6 years ago. It was a long time ago. But, well, it had all these great advances, like an open world, quest lines, quest rewards. They try to turn it into a more RPG. This game kind of lightens the RPG elements. It's not nearly as open world. While you can free roam, it's more in the vein of the first game, where returning to older areas is just a chance to grind out experience. Maybe look for new treasure using abilities you got and stuff like that. And while it's not bad, it just means that a lot of the good stuff that made Darksiders 2 a true cut above for its time just do not exist in this game. And to that end, the performance aspect of this game on the PlayStation 4, and I know that this will vary based on who plays it on what console. So if you play it on PC, PS4 Pro, Xbox One X, you probably don't have this problem. But this game has a large frame rate issue in varying points on PS4 normal. Like, I played the game, I don't own a Pro, right? I just play basic PlayStation. And this game, I mean, it's still playable, but it's what I would consider the borderline of playability. This is an action game. It's not like some type of game like a card game or a turn-based game where your frame rate doesn't really matter because, you're waiting for inputs. This game is pretty rough when it comes to its frame rate. And that's unfortunately one thing that I was not a fan of when I was playing through this game, is that it's hard to really do action-based gameplay on a system, or at least in a game that's not fully reached its capabilities and is not fully maxed out. And I mean, I can get if they needed to lock it to maybe a lower frame rate for normal consoles, but a steady frame rate, preferably on the higher end, for an action game like this is pretty much mandatory. I would really say it's mandatory in 2018. And I really don't want to smite the game for it, because I mean, the game is still playable, it's still beatable. But and as this segues kind of into gameplay, this game plays like Dark Souls. And I know that every game nowadays plays like Dark Souls, so it's kind of one of those meme things to even say about a game. But this game does have a lot of Souls aspects in it. For instance, there's, like the other games, you collect souls, or as they're called, lurchers in this game, which are basically collections of human souls. You use them as currency. When you die, you drop them in the overworld, and you have to go back and pick them up. You feed them to Vulgrim, who is now your source of leveling up, to gain experience, to put points into attributes. And again, like I said, this game is way more simplified. It's way easier than Dark Souls, or at least way less forgiving. Way less punishing. Because you could die, for instance, and you could have multiple lurchers in the overworld that you can go collect. In general, the combat is not as punishing. You heal based off of what is essentially the Estus Flask, but unfortunately, unlike the Estus Flask, you don't really get too many of them, and it's kind of laggy to use it. It has a long animation by comparison. It's kind of like Dark Souls 2, actually. But in general, this game has a very distinct From Software touch on the end, which I guess kind of goes with the theme of each game. I don't want to totally say that that's their plan, but it kind of ends up working out that way. So, for instance, if Darksiders 1 kind of feels like God of War mixed with a little bit of Zelda, and they all still kind of feel like that, but if that was kind of the baseline, and then Darksiders 2 has the more open world at the time, which was, considered to be a great thing to put in the game, the more open world approach of being able to free roam and fully explore an environment with puzzles and parkour and dungeons, then Darksiders 3's gimmick is to kind of basically be a Soulsborne game. It's to really try to challenge you through difficult encounters and high-stress gameplay, which is why I say that the performance aspect being less than optimal hurts it in such a manner, because in this case, we really need the game to perform optimally pretty much 24/7. We can't have any frame rate drops. We can't have the game locking up. And there's a lot of also silly segments in the gameplay. There's one segment in particular towards the end where you have to outwit a tornado that's sentient because reasons, and it's not a very fun thing to do. There's a couple other things. It's not so much like necessarily that the gameplay isn't fun. It just feels like it needs more refinement. For instance, Fury fights with a whip, and that's kind of her basic default weapon. Throughout the game, as you acquire new abilities, which are called hollows, this gives you access to newer, different types of weapons. So unlike Darksiders 2, where Death always had to use a scythe and then one other weapon, in this game, the weapon that you use is dependent on the hollow that you have equipped. So for instance, if you have the Flame Hollow equipped, you get these maul-like weapons that you could use to spread fire. If you put on the Force Hollow, which is like the power of Earth, you get a big mallet that has super armor properties and can stun enemies. If you use the Storm Hollow, you get a spear for long-range fighting and stuff like that. You also get a cross blade in this game that you could throw, kind of like the boomerang in Zelda, but it's definitely inferior to Darksiders 1's cross blade. And on top of that, you don't get any guns in this game. There's no gun that you get for ranged combat, unlike the first two games. You also don't get to ride a horse in this game, and I'm not going to reveal why, because it's a storyline spoiler, but you don't get to ride Fury's horse Rampage in this game. And while I would normally say that that's kind of fits with the theme, I think that that's also just indicative of the fact that this game is a very scaled down game compared to its predecessors. You explore the overworld through a mix of platforming and parkour. Each different hollow gives you different jump abilities. The one thing I will say that I always say about every Darksiders game is you do not get aerial combat. There is no fighting in the air. There's nothing you can do to make it easier to fight in the air. Pretty much you have one aerial combo because you're in the air and you're allowed to attack, and that's pretty much it. I really wish they would add that in, but I digress at this point. You also get a counterattack in this game from dodging. It's one of those perfect dodge systems. It's pretty lenient. Basically, if an enemy attacks and you dodge it properly, you enter a sort of slow motion mode for half a second, and you can immediately retaliate with a counter move. Now, seems pretty run-of-the-mill, seems pretty standard, but the problem with this is that when you try to counterattack, you don't get invincibility, you don't get super armor, so you could be damaged and hit and stunned while you're in your counterattack. And I think that for a game like this, where especially some fights really rely on you being able to do that, you should really be allowed to get super armor and invincibility when you decide to counterattack. Another thing is that when you do get a successful counterattack off, you basically have to use it right away. You only have a second to really use it before it fades and you return to your normal attacks. And I think that in a lot of cases that also is kind of annoying, because since you know that you're not invincible and you're going to take damage, if you see that their attack is continuing or whatever, and there's multiple enemies that are doing whatever, it's hard to really use it in a group setting, or if you dodge one attack, you kind of need to dodge the next two, and you might dodge you might dodge one or two perfectly, but you didn't get the last dodge perfect, so you don't get the counterattack, especially in bosses where you need the counterattack to deal damage. I also kind of don't really like the secondary weapon system. I think the secondary weapon system could be greatly improved. I think that you should be allowed to choose between which weapons that you get, because pretty much for most of the game, I just used the whip. It was just the best weapon. It worked in pretty much all scenarios, and pretty much everything about it is just better than the other weapons. Now, you can enchant weapons with certain attributes. These runes called enhancements that you could slot into your various weapons have a perk that you get when you're using the weapon, and a perk that you get just for having the rune equipped, period. And what's nice is that you have so many weapons, you could slot in so many things, and there's more than enough runes to fit into all 6 or 7 of the game's weapons. And it's really nice to be able to have that customization. I do like the fact that you can go back and re-explore older areas and basically, fight and gain experience. I think that the level up system isn't awful, it's just not great. You only have 3 attributes in this game, which are health, which is how much damage you can sustain before you die. You have your physical attack, which is how much damage you deal, which gets upped by percents. And you have your arcane, which deals with your wrath form, your havoc form, which is your super form where you transform into like the original incarnation of the various horsemen. So for Fury, she transforms into like this big monster that uses whips. Arcane also judges how much damage you do with counters and how much damage you do with your wrath attacks, which leads me into the next part of the combat. Is wrath attacks have been severely gimped in this game. In fact, this is probably one of the worst changes I think that they made in this game, is that you only get 1 wrath attack because you only have 1 bar. Before, in the other Darksiders, you got multiple bars, and each ability would consume 1, maybe 2 bars, and you would use that ability to kind of like, for instance, War had an ability where he would stab his sword into the ground, and then other swords would come up around him. Death had the ability to teleport behind people or summon familiars and stuff like that. Fury's active wrath move entirely depends on what hollow she has equipped at the time. And this can range from it usually is something like a damage over time ability for the first 2 hollows. 1 hollow lets you draw enemies in and then blow them up and away. And the last hollow lets you put up a shield that takes damage and slows enemies that hit you. And with no hollow equipped, you just do a normal kind of generic attack because they needed you to be able to do that. I don't really like that. I think that it was much better back when you could choose what different attacks you wanted for each situation. There's no teleporting, so while Fury is kind of agile, she does a lot of dodges and cartwheels and stuff, you never really feel like Death, where it was kind of like you could really manipulate the environment, teleport behind enemies, kind of get different things going on. And that was one of my favorite aspects of Darksiders 1 and 2, is that you kind of have this nice ability loadout that you could select between. And all those talent trees from Darksiders 2 are gone. All the various weapons and attributes are kind of also gone from Darksiders 2. They pretty much stripped away everything, but I think the Wrath system got hit the hardest because sometimes the damage over time ones are just not that good, especially if you're fighting bosses. I found that the only really good one was the Storm Hollow, the Stasis Hollow, which allows you to slow enemies that hit you, and it basically prevents you from taking damage, meaning that a lot of things you do are now safe. And I get why, if you have some abilities like that, you would want them to take up all or more wrath than others, but I still think that the older system with various powers would have been cool. And there's other items that you could use besides the Nephilim's Respite, which is your Estus Flask, for lack of a better term. There's other smaller healing items that are consumable. There's other items that will give you a full bar of wrath, give you a full havoc meter, increase your damage, prevent you from dying, all the usual stuff that's kind of been in Darksiders, just kind of repurposed to fit the style of game that this is. And again, none of it's bad. it just contributes to a game that pretty much stole most of its identity from another game and didn't really do too much like it's the previous ones to iterate and innovate on it. And I like the open world. I like the ways you get around. I think the grappling could maybe be a bit more hands-on and decent, because a lot of times the grappling will just sometimes not work. But other than that, I mean, Darksiders 3's problems generally stem from the fact that um, I feel like the people who made it, while they love Darksiders and they know what makes a good Darksiders game, they are just not too great at pulling it off. And I don't want to insult them, because I think that THQ Nordic did an amazing job given the circumstances. But it's clear that the quality of Darksiders 3 is a dip comparative to Darksiders 2 and 1. And it is still an enjoyable game. It is still a game I'd recommend. I know a lot of people will hear something like that and avoid it like the plague. I think that it is a good game, but especially if you have a pro, you know, maybe some of these issues won't be as big. But for me, with what I had, it was pretty harsh. I'm not going to deny. It was at some points just basically dropping into, you know, double digits barely for frame rates. So ultimately, Darksiders 3 was a decent, fulfilling, fun game, especially if you're a fan of Darksiders. But if you're not really a huge fan of Darksiders, I don't know if I would really recommend it, especially when Darksiders 1 and 2 are available for probably cheaper, since they've been out for a while, like a year or two on PS4 and Xbox One and PC. So what would I give Darksiders 3? Well, the story is pretty good. I like the story and the lore and everything. The graphics and the soundtrack are decent, but the performance could be much better. I think that that's one of the bigger problems with it. And last but not least, probably the biggest aspect of it, the gameplay could be so much better on so many different levels. And I think that that's kind of what really contributes to this game feeling a little bit lackluster at points, feeling like it needs more polish, like it needs to have that extra oomph put behind it to really make it a good game. So I'm going to give Darksiders 3 a pretty lower score than what I would give the other two. If I were to give Darksiders 2 a score, it would be like a 93 or something, somewhere along there. If I were to give Darksiders 1 a score, it would probably be like an 87. But Darksiders 3 kind of ranks a lot lower, and I don't want to completely butcher it. I'm going to give it a 77 out of 100. And the reason why is because the gameplay pretty much cuts it down to an 80 just on the gameplay alone. It's still a fun game. It's still a good RPG that has a lot of action moments, and it is still satisfying to play through. But there's so many aspects of the gameplay, from the controls to the wrath system to just everything, that some things that even Darksiders 2 and occasionally 1 got better. And I mean, I always appreciate a good Soulsborne game. Not really. I think that that's kind of a genre that's being overplayed, but this is far from the worst one I played. And I guess they kind of have a grasp of that game too, but they need to do more with what they have, especially on the third outing of the series. They need to do way more than what they currently are doing. And that's fine that if this game kind of sucked, just so that way they kind of get a good grasp, they get feedback for Darksiders 4 or whatever, which may or may not, you know, deal with the final horseman, which is Strife. It's fine if this is proof of concept, but do not get complacent, because this is not a good standard to just sort of park at. This is actually a pretty bad standard, I would say, to park at, and I'm definitely expecting better strides and better things from Darksiders 4, or whatever it will be called. So, Darksiders 3, decent game, not the best, far from the best game I played, especially in the series, but at least a solid entry that's okay to play. And I did enjoy it for what it's worth. So that's been this edition of The Verdict. Thank you, and I will see you guys next time.